Hi all. It's a great pleasure that you are all here together with me today. I'm really excited to talk with you about internet governance. As Glenn said, I am a postdoctoral researcher at University of Amsterdam and Texas A&M University. Glenn, you said I'm muted. I'm still muted, or I'm okay now? I'm okay now. Excellent. So I'll just continue. And I am actually sitting here at the University of Amsterdam because, of course, I couldn't fly to Texas A&M due to COVID. But I'm very happy we can be here together, and the virtual school on internet governance is allowing us to work together. That's great. So if you want to reach out, feel free to use the chat, use email, or hit me up on Twitter. What I will be talking about today is actually the last two chapters of my PhD called Wired Norms, the Inscription, Resistance, and Subversion of Norms in Internet Governance. So the nice thing is that if everything is clear, you don't need to read half of this PhD. And if it's the other good thing is that if it's not clear, you can read up about it in the PhD. So the PhD is available on my website, as well as all my other articles under open access. So you can go to nielstenhoever.net and have a look at the versions there. And because because you probably already have talked quite a bit about ICANN, that's where I know Glenn from, and many other people that I've seen actually that are speakers in this course, I chose to talk with you today about the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and RIPE, which is the Regional Internet Registry for Europe, the former Soviet Union, and the Middle East. And of course, in my studies, I focus on the logical layer of the Internet. And the logical layer, by now, it's the 9th episode of the course, you'll know it's the layer that ties together all the different physical networks and medias into one network, and thus producing the internetwork of networks. And it does and this happens through protocols, unique numbers, and unique addresses, and the setting of protocol parameters with which these networks then can communicate. So generally, there is a lot of focus on the things that happen on top of the internet, but not that much information below. And what you see here in this slide is actually a test. So I think you will not understand what this slide means right now, so I'll just give a short summary, and then maybe you won't understand it either. But hopefully, at the end of the talk, you will understand it completely, and that means you understand the main argument in my thesis, and you'll be able to make that argument as well. So I argue that the internet architecture, socio-technical imaginary, that's anchored in the architectural values of end-to-end openness and permissionless innovation, and in process values such as transparency and openness, is concretely subverted and only guides and facilitates and legitimizes the internet governance regime, whereas infrastructural norms, namely the infrastructural norm of interconnection, actually evaluates and instructs new candidate norms, such as policies, technologies, and institutional norms before they get inscribed in the internet infrastructure. So we'll start off with the Internet Engineering Task Force in the inscription and subversion of values in the transnational internet governance. So I don't know how many of you have actually been to an IETF meeting, but it is quite special. And if you would say that there is one institutional body that has been with the internet the longest, it is definitely the Internet Engineering Task Force. Even though it was only established formally relatively late, namely in the 90s, it was already a task force and a working group before to agree on the protocols to be used on the internet. And now meetings generally have 1,000 to 1,500 participants, and now they're held online. There are even actually more people participating. So this might actually, the IETF be coming through and becoming real true. But the real work that is done in the IETF is actually done on mailing lists. And so why do I look and bother with the IETF at all, right? So I do that because I want to study the internet. And the internet is, as you know, the backbone of information societies. So that means it also sets the rules. But if the internet infrastructure spans almost the whole planet and maybe arguably even into space, how do you then study the internet infrastructure and the way it set rules for society? Do you for that need a microscope or a telescope? In order to study the internet and the medium that it is, I look at the institutions in which it is being produced. I do that because infrastructure sets the invisible rules that govern the spaces of our everyday lives. And changes to the globalizing world, according to Keller Easterling, are being written not in the language of law and diplomacy, as they used to be, but rather in the language of infrastructure. And this is different from previous global communication networks that were actually standardized in multilateral bodies and thus negotiated according to the rules and regulations and processes of governance. So, as you know, this is not the case for the internet. But if we're going to analyze the internet, we should really make sure that we do not fall in the trap of technological determinism. Technological determinism, of course, says the uses made of technology are largely determined by the structure of technology itself. So, for instance, this device, by its design, is telling me how it should be being used. But this device actually cannot only be used to make holes in paper. I could also hit people with it or wear it as a hat. So it is not only technology that determines its use, but technology does say something about us, and it also influences us. In the words of John Culkin, we shape our tools, and thereafter they shape us. So technology is also a way of understanding the human condition, and philosophers such as Heidegger have said that it is actually the use of technology, it is what is making us human. But if we then look at sedimented technology that we all use, on which societies are built, so-called infrastructures, infrastructure is also not solely technical, because they are inherently relational and ecological. Because the roads that we drive on would not be working if they were not being maintained, and they would not be working if they were not standards for how wide they would be, because else it would be very hard to repair them, and that would be very hard without expertise. And so it's not just the material technology that makes up infrastructure, but also the knowledge structures, institutions, relations, agreements that are all needed to make the infrastructure run and to keep the infrastructure running. Because what is so important for infrastructure is that it fades into the woodwork of everyday life, because we simply expect it to work. But the irony is that for something to simply work, it actually needs a lot of work, but that work is very often invisible. And then the infrastructures only show up when they break, when no water is coming from the faucet, or when electricity doesn't work. So to understand the balance between technological determinism and social constructivism, which says technology can do whatever we want to do with it, I use to bridge those two, I use affordance theory. And that says that technology is constraining as well as enabling features, but they're not determining. So it means that the functional and relational aspects which frame while not determine the possibilities of technology. But be aware, soon we'll be done with theory and we'll dive into the empirics. But I know some academics out here must be loving this theoretical framing and setting up of the argument. And then for the last part of the theory, I use socio-technical imaginaries. a term developed by Sheila Yazanov that help explain how visions, symbols, and futures that exist within groups and society that influence behavior and the development of narratives, policy, technology, and institutions. And that is something that we see happening in internet governance, namely the co-production of this global network of networks with people with wildly differing interests, but also wildly differing backgrounds. So what brings them together is a socio-technical imaginary that allows them to produce technologies and policies, even though previously they've never worked together and might have not even had similar educations or language before it. So while you've been doing this course, it already became totally clear to you that internet governance has its own language. And when you come in, this might actually be a bit off-putting because it seems you don't get that language. So of that, there are two parts. Language can be seen as something to have an in-group, out-group. So to make it really clear who belongs to a tribe that engages in internet governance, for instance. But it can also be seen as a trade colony language, which is a language that no one speaks by themselves, but allows them to work, to speak, and to engage with other peoples who also do not speak this language by default. So new words get charged up in collaborations. So, and what is super interesting for understanding the Internet Engineering Task Force, and for that the Internet Engineering Task Force is quite different from all the other bodies, is that they have been documenting their work in the same document series, which still looks exactly the same, or pretty much the same as when they came out the first time. And now we have roughly 9,000 of these documents called RFCs, and RFC stands for Request for Comment. But if you start commenting, once a document has become an RFC, you're too late. So first, a document in different draft phases is called an internet draft, and when it's accepted, it becomes an RFC and gets a number. So all these RFCs set internet protocols and standards, but also the rules for the Internet Engineering Task Force and affiliated bodies itself, which kind of indicate that this body also sees itself as a part of the infrastructure of the internet. What is a very nice side effect is that because they have used the same document layout, it is very easy for researchers, both quantitative and qualitative researchers, to analyze these documents. Much easier than documents, for instance, in ICANN, which can be quite hard to find, let alone in UN bodies, where it's even harder. So this allows me then to research technology as a very human activity and the history of technology as well. And this then allows me to foreground how standard setting is a wild mix of politics and economics, of which human rights is a part as well, of course. So, but how to bring this in? So before we now dive in, I've showed you that I build on science and technology studies, as well as international political economy and a bit of international relations. And to be able to come to these findings, I did 25 interviews, quantitative analysis of all RFCs. So I used a lot of scripts to try to understand how authors related to each other, what words occurred, what words co-occurred, and what norms emerged in different times. But I also did qualitative analysis of RFCs that came up regularly when in interviews or from the quantitative analysis. And then next to that, because all official decisions within the IETF and also unofficial decisions are taken on mailing lists. So if you want to join the IETF and join in deliberation, the only thing you need is an email address and join the mailing lists. And all these conversations have been stored and archived. And that archive now is roughly 35 gigabytes, which is almost 2 million emails from 955 lists. And there I was also able to do network analysis. So who is talking to who has higher centrality, how do affiliations change over time. And all this analysis I tried to embed in the findings I got from participant observation during 4 years or 11 meetings worth of participation in the IETF. But if people are very interested in methods, we can talk about that later, because that's a particular field that academics really can enjoy talking about, but other people maybe not so much. So when I started looking at the IETF, I thought it would be really interesting to understand what are all these people from different parts of the world that produce this global network. What are their different values? What are different things they really care about? And if a community exists for quite a while, normally it starts to diverge. So in anthropology and sociology, you see that when a group is established, often people identify strongly across one thing or a few things, and then it diverges again. But in the IETF, to my great surprise, from the quantitative and qualitative analysis, I found that there were three things that were coming back again and again and again and again. Let me take you through these three. So the first one is the end-to-end principle. And the end-to-end principle says that the intelligence in a network should be at the edges, and that the network, or the internet itself, should only provide transport for these packets of information. This results in low complexity and high robustness. So, but before we go into this, I want to make sure that you all know what datagrams or packets are. And because some people might not be on this call, I'm going to explain it really quickly, because I think packets are one of the most core technologies of the internet and sometimes misunderstood. So previously, information was sent as circuits. And if you send information as circuits, you're really sending it in one long tail, one long line. So you know this from when you are on a telephone conversation and the connection drops. Then you're like, do you hear me? Yeah. Where do you leave off? So it's very hard to then know what you've missed and when you got connection again. So a way to fix this was the development of packets, and packets should be understood as little trucks. And trucks consists of two parts, namely the back part, the cargo sorter of the truck, so the back, and in the back there is all the information that you want to send in ones and zeros. But in the cabin of the truck, where normally the driver sits, that's the header. And the header says where the truck is coming from, where it wants to go, what its cargo is, and how far it wants to travel, and a bit of other information. So this is really great, because if you want to send a photo to someone else on the internet, a lot of, for instance, the photo gets cut into 100 little pieces. 100 trucks will find their way across the internet, and only one needs to arrive for the other end to know that you're trying to send them a photo, and that this truck is one of 100 little trucks. So if, say, 95 of the trucks arrive, you know which of the trucks have arrived, because these trucks are numbered, and then you also need to request which ones need to be sent again. So that's why, and in that way, you can see how a network that is only there to transport these packets can then offer a high reliability service, while even sometimes being unreliable, because then you can simply ask for these trucks to be sent again. And that's what makes the internet such a reliable distributed network. and why the end-to-end principle is important. But it's not just a technical concept. As one can see in the RFCs, in this case RFC 1958, you can see that, or the IETF says, is that the community, the IETF community, believes the goal of the internet is connectivity, the tool is the internet protocol, and the intelligence is end-to-end rather than hidden in the network. So this means that putting the intelligence and more power in the ends takes away power from the network itself. And here you already see something that we'll see later, is that in many texts there are a lot of socio-political concepts hidden in technical decisions. And this is also represented in many t-shirts that you can see that are worn at the IETF. And another RFC where you see this clearly socio-political conception is where it says here in RFC 3935, which is actually the IETF mission statement, that the internet isn't value neutral and neither is the IETF. We want the internet to be useful for communities that share our commitment to openness and fairness. We embrace technical concepts such as decentralized control, edge user empowerment, and the sharing of resources, because those concepts resonate with the core values of the IETF community. And these concepts have little to do with the technology that's possible and much to do with the technology we choose to create. Well, this is quite interesting because this is probably not something that you'd expect from a group of transnational corporations to agree on, but rather of a group of anarcho-syndicalists, right? So it's interesting that these multinational corporations say that what they choose is edge user empowerment and the sharing of resources. So that's a pretty interesting politics that you find there. And this can also be found in the second value that I found widely presented, namely permissionless innovation. And permissionless innovation dovetails nicely with the end-to-end principle, because it means that there should be no barriers for the deployment of new protocols, or no need to negotiate with entities in the middle of the network. This can be seen to a response to the earlier telco era, where the telecommunication providers decided what you could do on the network, and where the intelligence was in the network itself, and the edge devices were stupid. Remember those phones that had 11 or 12 digits, or 9 digits, 10 digits, and a star and a hashtag? Those were relatively stupid devices. But the network could render smart services. With the internet, it's the other way around. But it might actually also be a response to the early internet era, namely the National Science Foundation, when they ran the backbone of the internet, completely funded by the US government. It said, because it was a publicly funded institution, that no commercial traffic was allowed on the internet. This means that up to the early 90s, the internet was a non-commercial project. So everyone who tries to tell you the internet is the success of capitalism and of corporations, well, corporations have been a part of it, yes, but commercialization didn't happen up to the early 90s. And before that, it had been huge public investments since the 60s. Some would even argue since the Second World War.
Alert from calendar. Discussion with Chennai Chair.
Governments always had a significant involvement in the internet, and the people who want to work on it always try to have less restrictions to work on it, and that's where this permissionless innovation can be found in, so that they could deploy new things between the end nodes, and that the network itself would not be hampering the development of new things in between these endpoints. So the third part that comes back again and again is openness. And openness, of course, is open to many different interpretations, because openness in the most technical sense means that one can reach any endpoint on the internet without being hampered, altered, or stopped, and the ability to always add new endpoints to the network. So the internet can grow with new devices. It can also be directly reached. Openness also means open standards, and that means that standards are not obligatory and that they are freely accessible, that you don't need to buy them, that you can simply know, read, understand, and implement them. And then the third part of this third value is open governance. And that means that the governance should happen in transparent fashion with open participation, so everyone should be able to join, as you all will, I'm sure, and have open archives, as we've seen with the mailing lists and the RFCs. So that then produces quite an interesting governance regime for this global resource, right? And you can also see this in the IETF, where there are unofficial mottos such as, "We reject kings and presidents and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code." And a way to establish consensus is often done through humming, which means that people actually, if they agree with something, which means, think about that the largest global communication network that we have is not steered or managed or maintained mainly or developed by corporations, by governments, but by people who do. And the consensus building process and the humming is not voting, because the humming allows for a certain level of anonymity. And the consensus building process is also different than voting, because it is argued that in consensus building, there is not the majority that can suppress the minority. And so people should talk extensively until a consensus emerges. So that's what the IETF sees as different in the two. And there are many more stories connected to this, but I'll keep it with this. So there's been this amazing scholar called Sandra Brahman, who has shown by reading the first 1,000 RFCs, and she's a social scientist, so not a computer scientist, and she said for her it was sometimes like reading Martian upside down, but she read and coded them all word by word, and she concluded that explicit discussions about rights and freedoms, as well as social impact of technology, have featured in RFCs since their beginnings. So even talk about privacy and security, that many people say, well, people simply didn't think about it at the beginning. People did think about it, they simply never prioritized it in the implementation. But they were discussed, even its impact on democracy, since the early beginnings. But when we then saw the commercialization and privatization at the end of the 80s and the early 90s, we saw that the US government wanted to cede direct control over the network. And one of the reasons for that was that it was getting very expensive to run this resource. So the ARPANET, which was the military part, was discontinued. The Energy Net and the NSF Net also saw the costs increasing of the running of the backbone that all internet traffic was traversing to, and they needed a way to kind of deal with all these costs. So there were different solutions on the table, like have a fund, organize it via the UN, organize it for national governments. But what came out, and also try to think this within the time, this was the end of the 90s, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. It was the fall of the Soviet Empire. Short intermezzo. What you might know or not is that the development of the internet really took off with the launch of the Sputnik satellite. So when the Sputnik satellite, which was the first artificial satellite launched by the Soviet Union in 1957 or 1958, you could hear it all across the world with a haunting beep, beep, beep. And that really stimulated the US government to increase spending on science and technology, and also interdepartmental collaboration. And that then produced this distributed information network that is the internet. So when the Soviet Union fell, this was also, again, the Soviet Union that indirectly had a huge influence on the development of the internet, because then the US government said, well, we can like reduce our spending in this, and then find another way to do the spend to share the costs. But the question is, how was this to be done? Again, after the fall of the Soviet Union, you might remember the thinker Francis Fukuyama. He said, this is the end of the history. Liberal democracies have won. And it gave the rise to this Washington consensus where everything should be privatized because the market was far more efficient in organizing things than governments were, as it was believed then. So, of course, the solution for scaling the internet was privatization. And this led to the establishment of commercial internet exchanges and the formal institutionalization of the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Society, and regional internet registries. But then, what happened in one of these earliest meetings when the IETF was formally institutionalized, that a German statistician stood up in the central plenary, and somehow statisticians are always German, or many Germans are statisticians, and he said that if we continue with handing out IP addresses at this rate, within 3 years we will be out of IP addresses. And that means, so short intermezzo again, we have these little trucks, the packets that travel over the internet, and in their header it says where they come from and where they go. Where they come from and where they go is based on addresses. So these addresses are called IP addresses. And if you want to be connected to the internet, every device should have a unique address, because else these little packets will collide and do not know where to go. But this statistician claimed if we would continue with handing out addresses at the same speed, this would mean we would be running out of addresses, and we could not fulfill or live up to the promise of openness, which means that we would be able to add new devices. But we had no replacement or way to increase the number of IP addresses. And we also saw at the same time that security considerations became more a significant issue on the internet, because the internet was no longer comprised of only trusted actors, and there was a perceived need from network operators to differentiate business models and try to earn back some money from the huge investments they made into laying all these networks. So what then happened is what is now known as network address translation. And network address translation was supposed to be just a short fix in the internet, but it then turned out to be actually a huge change and a kind of, what I will argue, a watershed moment. Because what does network address translation do? It does translate a publicly facing IP address to many different private IP addresses within a network. So this is something that the router that you have at home will do. So if you know one IP address by heart, it will probably be 192.168.1.1. And this is not a public IP address, but this is one of the IP addresses that is given inside internal networks. And then you can share a public IP address with many different users at the same time with different devices. And so network address translation is implemented in home networks, but also in larger networks, where it's and even in very large mobile networks, where it's called carrier grade NOT. The great thing is that it then allows for organizations to share much smaller number of IP addresses and make more efficient use of them. But it also did other things. So NOT was then also used for security, because then all of a sudden there was a middle box and administrative control. So a lot of networks started to use it as an administrative control, and one thing that it was seen to be used for was to hamper peer-to-peer traffic. And so firewalls that were implemented then also in these devices didn't only serve a security purpose, but they also served a administrative control purpose. So that's a third party in the midst of these endpoints that could have some sense of control. But that would go directly against the idea of end-to-end. And a third thing that would happen is something called network management. So quality of service would have been done on these routers, and caching and prioritization of services, which later then spawned into net neutrality discussions. So, and this rise of the middle box, so these more active routers added functionality to the networks and enabled to uphold openness, but not at the edges, but actually in the network itself. And this led to ossification in the network. I'll come back to that. But it also introduced directionality. And in that sense, it created a difference in a plane where all computers were the same. It created a difference between users and producers, between clients and servers. And because all these devices that were behind a NOT device could not publicly advertise themselves easily through a unique IP address, because they would share an IP address. And that is one of the reasons why it is so hard to run a website from your phone, even though your phone is actually much more capable than many of the web servers I have had. So that is, and because that then gave the rise to many hosting providers and centralized servers, that then eventually led to an internet architecture that has an emphasis on centralization. And here you see that a very small technical issue where we just tried to have a quick fix for a problem before we came up with a new IP address scheme, then became a problem that is carrying over in years, and it's resulted in a completely different internet architecture than we actually thought it would be. And one of these technical inheritance we have is called ossification. So ossification means, ossification comes from biology, and it means that bones get harder. So, and which is useful, but when they become very hard, they also become brittle and break easily. And so in managing networks, you see that routers were starting to expect traffic to look a certain way. And when then the latest version of transport layer security was developed, and even though you might not know the abbreviation TLS, you've all used it because TLS stands for the S in HTTPS that creates a secure tunnel. In TLS 1.3 adds some new functions for the technology interested people among you. It adds forward secrecy. And it worked perfect in the lab, but when one sought to deploy it out in the wild on the internet itself, we found out it didn't work whatsoever. And it was very confusing. And then we only found out that when we put in the header of the packet that this was actually TLS 1.2 and not TLS 1.3, it worked perfectly. So routers were expecting trucks that looked a certain way, so trucks that looked in a different way were not allowed through. This means that if we want to design the internet of the future, it needs to look like the past. And that is the consequence of ossification and putting intelligence in a network. With TLS, we managed to solve it with a trick. Some call it elegant, some call it a hack, but TLS 1.3 calls itself TLS 1.2 until a cryptographic handshake has been made, and then it announces itself as, haha, I'm not TLS 1.2, I'm actually TLS 1.3. So for TLS that worked, but there has been a less good news for SCTP, the Stream Control Transmission Protocol. A protocol that has been worked on for 15 years in the lab and that has been described in over 39 RFCs and that many brilliant people worked on, but it never worked on the internet. And this is due to all the middle boxes that blocked SCTP, especially because it was on a very low layer, so it tried to be a replacement for TCP. And indeed, people blamed the network for this, because this was exactly what the internet was trying to overcome administrative hurdles that actually now had become technical hurdles because of technical debt. Blame the network. But as in many stories, this hurdle was overcome through the development of QUIC. So QUIC has many similarities to SCTP. It is a stream-based protocol, but what is really different is that it has been developed by Google. So what was Google able to do, and what differentiates them from others, is that they have servers everywhere around the world, but also access to the largest browser in the world. So this would allow them to do a lot of A/B testing on a lot of different points in the network to see where a protocol would work and where not. So if you use Chrome and you've used Google services, you might have helped in the testing of QUIC. And if it did not work, it could report back to Google and fall back to TCP, and we would know this new iteration did not work. So when QUIC then was developed, it also integrated TLS, remember, encryption. And we might think that's great because it allows us to have more privacy and protects us from snooping from attackers on the network. But what it also does, it ensures that network operators cannot ossify, cannot see anything of the traffic anymore because it is completely encrypted. And this gives them much less control over the data that runs over their networks, so they can optimize it less. So you see that here there is this continuous tussle between content providers at the ends and network providers in the middle to try to have control over data streams. So this step of adding encryption to everything does take power away from the network, puts it together to the endpoints, but what happens as well is that these endpoints were not all the same endpoint as before. They were consolidated on one hand because Google was one of the big providers, as we also have Amazon and a few others on that side. So only large efforts by a transnational corporation with significant control over the network and browsers could make the evolution and the change to the affordance structure of the network possible. Quick tooling is not available for everyone, and quick deployment will arguably strengthen consolidation because it puts you together in an encrypted stream with Google, and only then Google has access to your data. So it did overcome quite a lot of issues. Not directionality is still in place. So this means that I can still not, with Quick in place, easily host a server on my device. And that's of course also not in the interest of Google. And with ubiquitous encryption, it's also hard to analyze the network, for instance, on cookies. And of course, this did not please the network operators whatsoever. And so in an interview, I found out that if you want to actually have a protocol deployed, you need to play into some of the operators or the vendors' earning models in order to get something deployed. So this means then that these three values of end-to-end permissionless innovation and openness are maybe myths that are important for what they reveal, including a genuine desire for community and democracy, but also for what they conceal, including the growing concentration of communication power in a handful of transnational media businesses. So the socio-technical internet architecture imaginary and its self-regulatory governance model have not been able to safeguard freedom and equality of all nodes, of researchers, small companies, or individuals to innovate on the internet protocol level, to really have end-to-end connection with permissionless innovation. Permissionless innovation, for the purpose of retaining openness, has undermined itself and the end-to-end principle. So corporate interests have become a first-order consideration for protocols to be adopted and implemented. So these political conceptions of the architectural imaginary are fading increasingly into the background, whereas the importance and size of the internet architecture only has grown, and with it its societal implications. And these societal implications are not structurally considered. And whereas there have been security considerations since 1989 as an inherent part of RFCs, not all security considerations are as thorough as we want. So how do you make people think about notions as equality and freedom and human rights? So we tried to develop human rights protocol considerations. I wrote an RFC on that together with Corinne Path. But when then the first and up to now only human rights considerations section came out in an RFC, the section turned out quite different from what we had hoped and expected. Please read with me on the last paragraph here. The most fundamental of human rights is the right to protect oneself. The right to keep and bear arms is an example of this right. Implementations of TLS password can be used as arms kept and borne to defend oneself against all manners of attackers, criminals, governments, lawyers, etc. TLS password is a powerful tool in the promotion and defense of universal human rights. So here you see that the understanding of human rights by this author in the IETF is quite different from the human rights understanding as one would generally have it. And that shows that we still have quite a long way to go, and this can also be seen as the second part. I promise you I won't keep this long, and it will be shorter than the first part of the presentation, but it kind of illustrates and drives home what I've been telling you. But of course, feel free to put in any questions, and I'm also happy to give a short break if you need to. So if you don't mind, I'll continue. So let's continue with the second part, and that's the norm conflict in the governance of transnational and distributed infrastructures. And here we move from the IETF to RIPE, in the case of internet routing. So I think we should really look at the routing infrastructure, because a lot of people look at platforms, and you see this also now in many discussions about moderation on social media platforms. But as we've recently seen, if you look at the infrastructure is something you cannot escape. You can drop from a platform, but you cannot escape the infrastructure. Infrastructure is always needed in information societies, and it is very researchable, but people don't do it as much because it's not as visible. And the internet infrastructure is commonly used for censorship and surveillance. So I try to understand how norm setting and norm conflict works in a distributed and complex transnational infrastructure, such as internet routing, where there is not a single government that can make a rule, right? So how does this work? So some quick concepts about routing. We talked about the trucks that need to travel through the network, and they do so to these unique numbers. These are IP addresses. And these IP addresses are given out in blocks to networks. We also talked about that the internet is a network of networks. So these networks that jointly make up the internet are called autonomous systems. And all these autonomous systems have a number. And easily they are called autonomous system numbers. So if you want to travel from one IP address to another, you only have to know in which autonomous system that block of IP address is delegated, and then see how you can travel from one network to the other to then find that unique IP address in that other network. So that is the way routing on the internet works. Every network has a set of unique numbers for devices, and every network has a number, and then networks among each other agree and tell each other which numbers they are responsible for and to which other networks they are connected. So they pass on the data for other networks. That's how this mesh of internetworking in internet routing works. And to coordinate this, the regional internet registries assign autonomous system numbers to autonomous systems and then give them blocks of IP addresses. But as we've seen in the IETF, this is not solely a technical issue. And important computer scientists such as Clark, Roklowski, Solons, and Braden said that different stakeholders that are part of the internet milieu have interests that may be adverse. And accommodating this tussle is crucial to the evolution of the network's technical architecture. But currently, routing decisions are made based on a mixture of efficiency, trust, and economics. So I was wondering, how could we, in one of these regional internet registries, of which there are 5 for the different parts of the world, how could we try to make values that we all share part of internet routing? So to have a look at that, I designed an experiment. And for this experiment, the first thing I asked myself, what values to express? Of course, they should be relevant, applicable, ideally an existing framework, so I didn't need to explain them to people. And they should be transnational, as the internet and networks themselves. So I chose 2. The GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Commission. It's European Union law on data protection and privacy, and it unifies data regulation across the European Union. And it's interestingly applicable for inhabitants of the EU and EU citizens, also if they are outside of the EU. And it also addresses export of personal data outside of the EU and the European Economic Area. And the second value set are the United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. These, you might know these as the Iraqi Principles, but I'll tell you shortly how they came to be, is that in 1947, we agreed on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Just after the Second World War, when we all said, this never again. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was an aspirational document. It wasn't international law yet. That only came with the development of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and other treaties that came after. And jointly, these are the International Bill of Human Rights. But then, in the 70s, it also became increasingly clear that it's not just governments and citizens that have impact on human rights, but corporations too. And this led to the development of the UN Global Compact. And whereas many of you may have not heard about the UN Global Compact, you have heard the term that it gave rise to, namely corporate social responsibility. And even though it was a great improvement over what we've had, it often meant this company has an oil spill here, but it's building a school there, so it's fine. So of course this was problematic, and this led to the development of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights under the lead of Harvard Law Professor John Ruggie, which are called the Ruggie Principles. And the Ruggie Principles have 3 pillars, namely the responsibility for states to protect human rights, to actively go out and protect, for non-state actors such as corporations and organizations to respect human rights, to ensure that within their organization and the chain that they are responsible for, no human rights violations occur, and for citizens to have access to remedy in case human rights get violated. So what I did was develop 2 objects in the RIPE database to which autonomous systems could sign up that would simply say that a member of the set would declare to be compliant with the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union, or to declare to have adopted and implemented the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I thought this was very applicable because many of the networks in RIPE had to be compliant with the GDPR because they are based in the European Union and handling data from European citizens. So I thought it would be easy for them to accept it. And similarly, some of these companies had actually signed up to the UN Guiding Principles. So I thought it would be easy to also put this in their routing decisions. And to my great surprise, this was rejected off the bat. So I really tried to understand why this was the case. What I found out is actually there is a significant amount of infrastructural power and infrastructural normativity in this community and in internet governance that set collective expectations for the behavior of actors with a given identity. And in this case, it was actually the expectation, what I call the interconnection norm, of network operators and people engaging in internet governance to produce interconnection between transnational corporations, and to do that in a voluntary, bottom-up and collaborative way based on trust. And that networks would facilitate and engage in interconnection through the Border Gateway Protocol, and that a regional internet registry such as RIPE would coordinate and facilitate such interconnection through its databases and registries, but that everyone completely kept control over their own networks, and that interconnection should always be based on incentive structures and enlightened self-interest. And this meant that these values that I try to introduce of some things that you think would be pretty clear-cut, such as human rights and privacy regulation, were rejected, but based on the reason of technology, that our routers do not allow for that, or for an institutional reason. Well, the database is not meant for that, or this is not how it's done in how we do things, or with an economical argument, there is no economic incentives for this. And it all went back to this infrastructural norm of interconnection that expects that more interconnection is made. And this is also caught in a sentence that you might hear a lot in internet governance, two sentences actually. And that is, what we do is for the good of the internet. And whereas that sounds completely fine, it implies that what is good for the internet is good for society. And what is good for the internet is more internet. And what is good for the internet is more interconnection. Whereas it might actually be more complicated, because maybe some kind of interconnection we do not want. Maybe we do not want to connect certain networks, or not in certain manners. But in its current configuration, everything that complicates or hampers interconnection gets resisted. So the voluntary interconnection norm instructs the epistemic community, the experts of network operators in RIPE, to create more interconnection between and among networks and resist any norm or value that could hamper that. And so the internet governance is guided by the internet socio-technical imaginary, anchored in architectural values and process values such as end-to-end, permissionless innovation, openness and transparency. But this socio-technical internet architecture imaginary serves to guide and facilitate the process of norm development and legitimize the current ordering, but are actually subverted in practice, as we've seen in the first part. But the infrastructural norms exist to instruct new norm development and evaluate these new candidate norms that are being introduced. And the introduction of new norms is successful if the candidate norms serve the interest of the significantly represented groups and are not in conflict with the overarching infrastructural norm of voluntary interconnection and interoperation. And with that, you now all of a sudden understand this pyramid that at the beginning of the presentation you had no idea what it meant. And with that, you understand what I wrote down and been investigating in 5 years in my thesis. So this also means, and this is a bit of the future work, is that or where we are now in the world, is that the internet, the private or multi-stakeholder internet governance regime undermines its own authority, scope, and legitimacy because it resists norms that are in the interest of nation states. So what we currently see is the rise of a multilateral or unilateral internet governance regimes, where you see areas such as the European Union develop regulation because they cannot achieve what they want through internet governance. And you do not only see this in Europe, you also see this in China, you see this in Russia, in the US, and Brazil. So if then regulation becomes the alternative for internet governance, say, over internet networks becomes smaller. So there are two ways, roughly, for this to go forward. Either the importance of internet governance diminishes and gives away more power to multilateral internet governance, or somehow private internet governance absorbs these concerns and overcomes this infrastructural norm of interconnection. And some of these tussles we already see within 5G, and that is what my postdoc is about. So in the future, I hope to continue work on this and tell you about how the regimes of 5G completely change all this, so that I can compare ICANN, IETF, RIPE, and the 3GPP. So thanks so much for your attention. Feel free to reach out at any time with your questions or comments, either in the chat, via email, or on Twitter. And thanks so much for your interest in internet governance. It's really important that if we want to build our information societies on public infrastructures, that they reflect also public values. Thanks so much.
Wow. Niels, that was fantastic. I'm getting a bit of feedback here. I think I'm okay now. That was overwhelming, actually. There's a lot to take in for people, and I think it's worth the recording to look through it and dive into it. Those who've gone to IETF meetings, they know about the humming, and those who've actually had an opportunity to attend their local RAR sessions, it's well worth as well. So this is really quite astounding. So I want to turn to the chat. Anyone have any questions for Niels?
Niels, this is Alfredo. I do have a question. And through your presentation, you're talking a lot from the perspective of different organizations that are supposed to deliver some sort of regulation and some sort of standardization in the use of the internet. But from the end user's point of view, what do you think should be our role in that process? You're muted.
You're muted.
Yes.
Sorry, Alfredo, you asked what is the role of who in the process?
Of the end user.
Yeah, so so the thing is that the end user is overpowered by many transnational corporations. So you see a lot of participation of individuals within internet governance, but their resources, knowledge, and numbers are outweighed by the corporations. And even if civil society or end users are able to make a point in internet governance, there are often voluntary standards that are not obligatory implemented. So there is a significant democratic deficit there, which I think should be addressed. So the power of the end user should be increased, and societal values should structurally be taken into account in the development of internet infrastructure. And not just in the development, also in the deployment and maintenance.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the participants? I don't see any more questions, and I don't know if Glenn, I know he had another meeting. So I do want to thank you, Niels, for the astounding presentation. It was so fascinating. I learned a lot, although I knew the concepts, but the way that you you organized the presentation and moved us from theory to practical ideas and concepts. It was great. So I enjoyed it a lot. I'll invite all the participants to please follow through the discussion thread, asking questions to Niels. I know he will be available to answer them, or you can chat directly to him through email. He gave us his email address at the beginning. Glenn, back to you.
Great. Thank you, everybody that joined today. Thank you, Alfredo, for those comments. A ton of questions. I'm going to watch the video again after it's done. There's so many questions, and please, Niels, don't take the silence as ignorance or a fear of asking anyone. This is a lot of material to absorb. In case like Bill, he's up at 6 a.m. So, and I noticed he was very active in the chat as well. Great stuff. Thank you so much again for your participation. We look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels, and thank you everybody that participated. This session has concluded. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.